You've got 10 minutes for one book and a big idea. I'm Aldina Williams. I'm a Labour MP. I'm talking to Toby Moore. He's an economist. And this week, it's the Entrepreneurial State. Hey, Toby.
Hi, I don't know. Thank you for having me on.
Thanks for joining me. I'm excited about this book. It is a book about the economy that we both love. It makes the case that government has sat behind some of the biggest breakthroughs and also taken on the risk of those. Why is this book that you love?
So The Entrepreneurial State is a book that's been really important for me. As someone who's sort of on the left of economic thinking, I think it's a really important book. And I think the main thing it contributes is it really pushes back hard against these particular preconceptions that we've had of what the private sector is good at and what governments are not good at. And Mariana Mazzucato, really makes the argument that the state's had an important role to play in innovation and taking risk and transforming the economy. And as I said, it really pushes back against these sort of ideas that we've had that the state is rigid, it's bureaucratic, its job is to get out of the way of more dynamic private sector actors. And I'm sure as a Labour MP, this is something that you've probably had to deal with as well.
It's one of those things that I have thought about as pushing back on the myth that the state is slow and that everything government does is somehow going to be less efficient than the private sector, and that this framing about business as dynamic and brave, those things can be true, but when she details specific case studies, she really makes the case for how the innovation story that we tell ourselves and are used to hearing from entrepreneurs is just about a few people who are involved in it, and the people who are in and out of that is not only government, but a lot of the people who take on those roles and work and that also miss out on enjoying some of the big windfalls of that innovation. Something I'm interested in this is how she uses the example of the development of the iPhone and of Apple's innovation story, and then also how government sat behind that for many decades. Do you think we can take away something for the way that New Zealand's state might incentivize big breakthroughs in our tech or other sectors?
Yeah, I think there are important lessons for us. I think the point that you're making, that her contribution is much about the stories that we tell around innovation as anything else, is really important, because the example that she uses is Apple, which of course is one of the most successful private businesses of the modern era, known for a number of innovations, things that we now take for granted that are a huge part of our lives. And this is as much a book of her looking forward and saying, here's what the state could do, as it is sort of saying we need to reinterpret where these successes came from.
Yeah, that's right.
We need to, we know the story of Steve Jobs. We know the importance of the iPhone and all these technologies. But actually the story that hasn't been told around that is a much more diverse ecosystem of public and private investment that led to those breakthroughs. And so she gives these really good examples of every single technology, basically, that goes into the iPhone, whether that's touchscreen technology or GPS or microprocessors, all at some stage early in the development of those technologies being supported by some quite significant public investment.
And so then some of the critics of this book, and probably anyone who's watching along goes, well, is then the answer to get to be able to speed up, the kind of innovation that we're talking about here? Is the problem that in some of those ways that the state can be bureaucratic, it also creates sort of gates or barriers for that kind of innovation? And here comes Ezra Klein with his book Abundance, that sets out an agenda for taking away all of the barriers to innovation, and that in some ways looks like traditional 1980s New Zealand deregulation. How do we marry those two streams of thinking up?
Yeah, I think the interaction between the two is really interesting. Ezra Klein's book, I think, is an important contribution, and it's a book I really enjoyed reading. As you say, there are quite mixed responses from to that book, Abundance, on the left, with a lot of people viewing it as sort of a bit of an agenda for deregulation. I think there are some important complementarities here with Mazzucato's work, and I think some that are particularly relevant for New Zealand. One of those is, as much as we might want to, rebalance the story about where innovation comes from, doing industrial policy well is really hard.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of state capacity. It takes a lot of trial and error. It really requires building up a skill set and a depth of data and information and engagement that certainly the New Zealand government hasn't been doing for some decades now.
That's interesting. I think one thing that was really fascinating for me to learn was just how much capacity there was, for instance, in the Commerce Commission when they were running this project of market studies. And after having done pure market studies under Labor, then moving to the supermarkets and the banks, by the end of that process under Labor, they were well tooled up to do it. And they had a process for doing that to understand the market. So I guess the lesson here is if you are going to use the state and its capacity to, incentivize innovation and to understand where markets are failing and where it needs to be, you also need that capacity within a state to be able to do that, to have the people who are skilled and can do those jobs.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we always need to bear in mind, as a small economy closely linked to Australia, it takes time to build up that capacity. But all of a sudden, if we get a change of direction in the policy the government's implementing, that capacity doesn't necessarily stay there. And if those people who have built up those skills and relationships are disappearing off overseas, it takes some time for us to get back to that point. The other thing I wanted to say about the interaction with the book you mentioned, Abundance, is, it's quite easy to read The Entrepreneurial State and say, okay, this is a book about general purpose technologies, about big transformative technologies. And that's not necessarily what we'd expect New Zealand to be churning out sort of year after year. I think a lot of New Zealand's problem has been sort of weak diffusion of existing technologies and the adoption of these things that in our productive processes that are relatively well established overseas. But I think the other way to read Abundance is just an approach to government's role in the economy that is very, very clear about what its purpose is, that doesn't overcomplicate what we're trying to do by adding too many conditions and hurdles and additional objectives to it that often undermine both what we're trying to achieve and people's buy-in to what we're doing.
Yeah, exactly.
And the other way I think you can read that is just sort of saying, well, we can stop and think about what are the things that New Zealanders need in their everyday lives to be able to reliably access and buy and be able to afford basic things like energy or food or housing or transport, and say, how do we reorient the state to be very, very good at providing these things, rather than falling back on what we often end up doing on the left, which is if we want households to have access to something, we subsidize them to do it. And in doing that, it often just makes it more expensive for us to provide those services to people.
I think that's an interesting one in the context of fuel crisis. Treasury reporting that there's a possibility that inflation will continue to rise up to 7.5%. ANZ have now revised their predictions and said there might be 3 hikes this year. What's your thinking on how governments around the world, when the cost of borrowing is higher, when there is political pressure to respond to the cost of living crisis, how should we on the left be thinking about the role of the state?
It's a good question. I mean, with all of the shocks that we've been seeing in recent weeks from the global economy, I very much thought back to my time in Grant Robertson's office where I was his economic advisor. We also saw, disruptions to supply chains, a lot of shocks occurring through the post-COVID era as we continue to deal with that. And we saw inflation rise in New Zealand as it did in a lot of other countries. There's a lot of very sort of familiar feelings around this time. Partly, that feeling that we had sort of come to understand and respond and perhaps got on top of a particular shock only for another one to reemerge. There were certainly times where we thought inflation had peaked during that time, only for the Ukraine war to kick off and that process to start again, for instance.
Yeah.
I think the major lesson we need to learn is, for particularly governments of the left coming in and wanting to, solve a lot of the problems that we see in the New Zealand economy, we do need to be really focused on what we want to do, and we need to be prepared for the fact that increasingly governments are going to spend their time responding to events that are beyond their control, whether that's extreme weather events, whether that's further geopolitical instability, whether that's other things that aren't even on our radar now. That sort of effective response role is going to be hugely important, and it's going to be therefore very difficult to balance everything else that we want to do.
We've gotten to the bit where I'm going to ask you what you're reading at the moment. I am reading an author we both love. My choice this week is Randomisters by Andrew Leigh. He's the Federal Commerce Minister in Australia. This is a book about randomized policy trials, randomization in science. It is a book about innovation, right on thing.
Sounds perfect. The book I'm reading at the moment, I'm quite glad I'm reading it for the purpose of this discussion, because there would certainly be weeks where I was reading something far less worthy. But the book I'm reading is called Values by Mark Carney. So Mark Carney wrote this book after he'd been the governor of the Bank of England. And of course, after he wrote this book, he ended up being the Prime Minister of Canada more recently. But it is a really impressive book, both in terms of the scope of his knowledge on a huge number of areas, and also in terms of how he approaches the discipline of economics. His argument is very much in line with a sort of Mazzucato worldview that, the economy is there to serve society. And when we have too much deference to the demands of the economy, where we put those considerations first, that's when we start to see society kind of, building tensions. We start to see, a lot of people losing faith in politics. We start to see our society going in the wrong direction. So it's been a fascinating read. It's one I'd recommend to your listeners.
And it's us.